To understand the tragedy of the red planet, one must first understand silence. For us on Earth, silence is a rare thing. Our world is a noisy riot of life-wind crashing waves and human machinery. But on Mars, silence is a heavy physical weight. It is a silence that has lasted for billions of years, broken only by the whisper of thin wind shifting the red dust or the occasional crack of a stone finally succumbing to the freeze-thaw cycle of the ages. Mars is not merely a planet, it is a grave. It is a retired soldier, an ancient sentinel standing guard in the cold darkness between the warmth of Earth and the chaotic gas giants beyond. The scars of the old soldier. If you could stand on the surface of Mars and look down, you would see a face ruined by violence. Mars has a history that is both magnificent and terrifying. 4 billion years ago, this world was alive. It had rivers that carved deep valleys, lakes that filled craters, and perhaps even a thick atmosphere that hugged the planet like a warm blanket. But the universe is cruel to the small. Mars fought a war against the solar system and it lost. Look at the Hellas Planitia. It is not just a hole in the ground, it is a wound. Billions of years ago, an asteroid the size of a mountain slammed into the southern hemisphere. The impact was so powerful that it nearly shattered the planet. It punched a crater over 2,000 kilometers wide and 9 kilometers deep. If you stood at the bottom of that basin, you would be standing in one of the deepest scars in the solar system. Mars took that hit and survived, but it never fully recovered. Look at Olympus Mons. It is the largest volcano we have ever found. It stands 3 times taller than Mount Everest. It is a monument to the dying heat of the planet. When Mars began to cool, its crust thickened, and the lava had nowhere to go but upbuilding. A mountain that pierces the very top of the atmosphere. It is a silent giant now dormant and cold, a testament to the fiery youth the planet once possessed. For eons, Mars has endured. It has endured the stripping away of its magnetic shield. It has endured the solar wind, a stream of charged particles from the sun slowly tearing its atmosphere away, molecule by molecule, bleeding its air into space. It has endured dust storms that grow so large they swallow the entire planet, turning day into night for months at a time, scrubbing the rocks down to their iron bones. The iron reacted with the little oxygen left, rusting the entire world red. Mars is old. It is tired. It is a planet that has seen everything done everything, and has settled into a frozen, watchful sleep. It sits there, a rusty jewel in the night sky, watching its younger blue sister Earth teem with life while it remains a barren memorial to what could have been. But the universe is not done with Mars yet. The interstellar guest. While Mars sat in its silent vigil, something was moving in the deep dark void between the stars. Far beyond the edge of our solar system, in the true emptiness of interstellar space, an object was travelling. It had no name, not for a long time. It was a shard of ice and rock ejected from a dying star system millions of light years away. It had travelled in the dark for eons, frozen in a sleep deeper than Mars could ever know. Astronomers on Earth would later name it 3i Atlas. The 3i meant it was the third interstellar object humanity had ever detected following the mysterious Oumuamua and the comet Borisov. But Atlas was different. It was not just a passing rock, it was a monster. Atlas was young in the cosmic sense. It was jagged, raw and volatile. Unlike the round, smooth planets of our solar system that have been polished by billions of years of orbits, Atlas was a splinter of chaos. It was shaped like a twisted spearhead tumbling end over end through the vacuum. It was composed of exotic ices, frozen nitrogen, carbon monoxide, and water materials that had never felt the warmth of a sun. It entered our solar system not on a flat plane like the other planets, but from above, diving down at a steep angle. It moved with a speed that defied common sense, 87 kilometers per second. At that speed, you could travel from New York to London in less than a minute. It was moving too fast to be captured by the sun's gravity. It was a bullet fired from the dark, destined to punch through our neighborhood and leave just as quickly. But its trajectory was special. It was not aiming for the sun. It was not aiming for Earth. By a stroke of cosmic probability, a chance of 1 in a trillion, its path intersected perfectly with the orbit of the ancient Sentinel. The convergence. The year 2025 began with whispers in the astronomical community. Telescopes in Hawaii and Chile picked up a faint anomaly. By May, the whispers turned to shouts. By August, it was the only thing the scientific world could talk about. The contrast between the two bodies was poetic and terrifying. On one side, you had Mars 4 billion years old, made of heavy rock and iron, spherical, slow and dead, and it moved with the predictable steady rhythm of a clock orbiting the sun at 24 kilometers per second. It was the embodiment of order and history. On the other side, you had Atlas, a visitor from the unknown, young and aggressive, made of fragile ice and gas, jagged and tumbling. It was moving nearly 4 times faster than Mars. It was the embodiment of chaos and the unexpected. As October approached, the distance between them closed. Humanity watched through the electronic eyes of the rovers on the surface, Curiosity and Perseverance and the orbiters circling above. The tension was palpable. This was not an impact event. Calculations showed Atlas would not hit Mars directly, but it would be a close approach, a term that sounded gentle but meant something violent in astrophysics. Atlas was going to skim the upper atmosphere of Mars. A body that large, moving, that fast passing, that close would create a shockwave of gravitational and atmospheric pressure unlike anything recorded in human history. It was a meeting of 2 eras, the deep geologic past of the solar system colliding with a messenger from the deep galaxy. October 3rd, 295, the date is etched into history. On the morning of October 3rd, the sky over the Martian equator changed. Usually the Martian sky is a butterscotch pink during the day and a pale blue near the sun at sunset, but on this day a second sun appeared. It started as a bright, piercing star that grew brighter with every passing minute. It was Atlas reflecting the sunlight as it dove toward the red planet. It wasn't burning, it was sublimating. As the alien ice of Atlas met the faint heat of the sun and the friction of the Martian exosphere, it began to scream. Gas exploded from the surface of the interstellar guest, creating a tail of brilliant white and electric blue that stretched for thousands of kilometers. To a hypothetical observer standing in the shadow of Olympus Mons, it would have looked like a sword slashing through the heavens. The ancient sentinel, which had slept in silence for eons, suddenly woke up. The gravity of the passing intruder tugged at the planet. The atmosphere of Mars, thin as it was, compressed and ignited in a bow shock ahead of the object. The silence was broken not by sound, for the air was too thin to carry a roar, but by pressure. Sensors on the surface rovers spiked. The ground trembled not from an earthquake, but from the sheer gravitational tidal wave of the flyby. For a few breathless hours, the old rusty world and the young icy traveller danced a dangerous tango. Atlas dipped low, skimming the very edge of the breathable altitude, glowing like a welding torch. The red dust of Mars rose up to meet it, drawn by the static charge, creating a swirling vortex of red and white. It was a moment of violent beauty. The weary soldier was being assaulted by the energetic youth. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the peak passed. Atlas, travelling too fast to stop, slingshotted around the planet, stealing a tiny fraction of Mars's orbital energy to boost its own speed even higher, flinging itself back out toward the blackness of deep space. But it left something behind. As the blinding light of Atlas faded into the distance, the sensors on the Martian surface did not return to normal. The atmosphere was churning, the dust was not settling. The ancient sentinel had been disturbed and the equilibrium that had held for 1 billion years was shattered. On the evening of October 3rd, as the sun set over the Gale crater, the sky turned a deep bruised purple. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was an expectant silence. The visitor had gone, but the door it had kicked open remained ajar. Mars was no longer just a grave. It was a womb, and something new had been sown in the chaos of the past. To the naked eye, the night sky looks like a fixed tapestry of stars, predictable and calm. But when telescopes swivel toward the darkness, they reveal a universe that is chaotic, violent, and often completely baffling. This is where we find Atlas. To call it a comet is technically correct, but it feels like an understatement. It is less like a dirty snowball melting in the sun and more like a celestial warning shot. As the data began to pour into the servers at NASA and the European Space Agency, or ESA, the mood in the control room shifted from excitement to confusion. A standard comet follows a recipe. It is a frozen rock that wakes up as it gets closer to the sun. The heat turns the ice into gas, creating a tail. We have mathematical models for this. We can predict exactly how bright a comet will get and how fast it will move. Atlas, however, decided to break every rule in the book. The first thing that alarmed the astrophysicists was the sheer scale of the object's atmosphere known as the coma. The nucleus of a comet, the solid rock in the centre, is usually quite small, perhaps only a few kilometres wide. But the cloud of gas and dust surrounding Atlas exploded outward with terrifying speed. In a matter of days, this ghostly green shell had expanded to a diameter of hundreds of thousands of kilometres. At one point, the gas cloud surrounding this tiny rock was nearly half the size of our own sun. This does not make sense under normal physical laws. For a nucleus to hold on to that much atmosphere, it usually needs significant gravity, but Atlas is small. It should not be able to maintain a cloud that massive. It looked as though the comet was not just melting but detonating in slow motion. It was shedding its mass at a rate that suggested it was dying, yet it continued to race forward. Then came the light. In astronomy, light is information. By analysing the light curve, how the brightness changes over time, scientists can understand the structure of the object. Standard comets brighten gradually as they approach the heat of the star. Atlas, however, began to exhibit violent outbursts. It would flare up, becoming hundreds of times brighter in a single night, and then suddenly dim only to flare up again. This erratic heartbeat of light suggested that the interior of the comet was unstable. It was not just ice turning to steam, it was likely that pockets of volatile gases like carbon monoxide and cyanogen were exploding from beneath the surface. Imagine a mountain that is also a minefield, triggering explosions that rip chunks of the surface apart. These outbursts act like rocket thrusters. Every time a jet of gas shoots out, it pushes the comet, making its path slightly unpredictable. This creates a non-gravitational force, a nightmare for anyone trying to calculate a precise trajectory. But the most unsettling aspect of Atlas is its path through space, the hyperbolic orbit. Most things in our solar system move in ellipses. The Earth, Mars, and Halley's Comet all move in oval shapes, endlessly circling the Sun. They are permanent residents of our neighbourhood. A hyperbolic orbit is different. It is an open curve, not a closed loop. When the scientists at ESA plotted the coordinates, the numbers painted a stark picture. Atlas is moving too fast to be captured by the Sun's gravity. Its velocity is tens of kilometers per second, a speed so high that the Sun cannot hold it back. This trajectory implies one of two things, both of which are humbling. The first possibility is that Atlas has been falling toward us from the Oort cloud, the frozen graveyard at the very edge of the solar system, for millions of years. It has been falling for so long that it gathered incredible speed, and now it is just passing through. It will swing around the Sun once and then be flung out into the deep, empty void between the stars, never to return. It is a one-time visitor, a ghost passing through a room. The second possibility is even stranger. The extreme hyperbolic nature suggests it might be an interstellar object, a wanderer that was kicked out of a completely different solar system. If this is true, Atlas is an orphan from an alien star, travelling through the galaxy alone until it accidentally crossed our path. The confusion within the scientific community is palpable. In press conferences, you can see the hesitation. Researchers love patterns. They love when X* plus Y equals Zolos. With Atlas, Dexter plus Y equals a question mark. The models predict the comet should have disintegrated completely by now, turning into a stream of dust. Yet the core remains battered and venting gas, surviving against the odds. The chemical composition adds another layer to the mystery. Spectroscopic analysis, breaking the light down into colours to see chemicals, shows unusually high amounts of carbon-2 and cyanogen. This gives the coma its eerie green glow. But the ratios of these chemicals are not matching the standard fingerprint of comets formed in our local region. It is made of the wrong stuff. Standing before these monitors, watching the green pixel move against the black background, the scientists feel a profound sense of smallness. We often think we have conquered physics. We can split the atom, we can land rovers on Mars. But then the universe throws something like Atlas at us. It reminds us that our solar system is not a closed, safe box. It is a busy intersection in a chaotic galaxy. We are witnessing a violent, beautiful death on a cosmic scale. Atlas is tearing itself apart, bleeding gas and dust into the vacuum, lighting up the dark like a flare. It ignores our predictions. It ignores our gravity. It is a reminder that out there in the deep dark there are forces and phenomena that we are only just beginning to comprehend. We are not the masters of this domain. We are just the observers watching a mysterious traveller speed by, wondering where it came from and what secrets it is carrying away into the eternal night. The silence of space is the first thing to break. As the comet approaches the red planet, it is no longer a single lonely wanderer. It has become a weapon. The massive gravitational pull of Mars begins to wrestle with the icy intruder long before it touches the atmosphere. This invisible hand of gravity pulls harder on the front of the comet than the back, stretching it, torturing the structure of the ice and rock until it can no longer hold together. With a silent, violent shudder, the nucleus fails. It does not split cleanly, it shatters. The once solid mountain of ice crumbles into a chain of jagged fragments resembling a string of pearls made of city-sized mountains. This is the first phase of the nightmare. Instead of one massive bullet, Mars is now staring down the barrel of a cosmic shotgun. As these fragments cross the threshold towards the planet, we must understand the terrifying math of the situation. In our daily lives, we think of danger in terms of weight, a heavy car, a falling rock. But in the mechanics of the cosmos, weight is secondary. The true monster is speed. The energy carried by these objects is calculated by their mass multiplied by their speed squared. Because the speed is so incredibly high, travelling at tens of kilometres every single second, the energy does not just double, it multiplies exponentially. A rock the size of a house moving at this velocity carries more destructive potential than the most powerful bombs ever built by humans. The atmosphere of Mars is thin, less than 1% of Earth's, but it is thick enough to react. As the first fragment screams into the upper air, the friction is instantaneous. The air in front of the rock cannot move out of the way fast enough. It gets crushed, compressed, and heated to temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. The fragment begins to glow with a blinding blue-white light trailing a tail of vaporized stone and superheated gas. From the surface, it would look like a second sun has suddenly switched on, racing toward the ground. Then comes the impact. The first fragment strikes the distinct rusty plains of the northern hemisphere. There is no thud, no simple crash. When a solid object hits the ground at 20 kilometers per second, it behaves more like a fluid than a rock. The asteroid and the ground it hits both vaporize instantly. The solid rock of the Martian crust is turned into gas in a fraction of a second. This sudden transition from solid rock to expanding gas creates an explosion of unimaginable scale. If you were to combine all the nuclear weapons currently existing on Earth and detonate them at once, it might begin to approach the energy release of just this one impact. A shockwave rips outward, moving faster than the speed of sound. It flattens everything. Ancient ridges, sand dunes, and rock formations that have stood undisturbed for millions of years are erased ground into fine powder instantly. At the center of the impact, a crater is born. The ground acts like water into which a pebble has been thrown. The crust pushes down, then rebounds upward, forming a central peak while the edges ripple outward to form the crater rim. But this is rock, not water. The ripples freeze in place, creating a scarred ring of destruction that measures nearly 100 kilometers across. But the nightmare is not over. This was only the first fragment. Moments later, the second piece hits, then the third. The bombardment continues, a relentless drumming of kinetic death. Each impact adds to the chaos, overlapping shockwaves that compound the destruction. The ground of Mars creates a seismic ringing, shaking the entire planet like a struck bell. Marsquakes of a magnitude never before recorded ripple through the core of the planet, triggering landslides thousands of kilometers away from the impact zones. The heat generated is intense. The energy of motion is converted into thermal energy. The impact sites are not just hot, they are molten. Lakes of lava form instantly where there was once dry frozen dust. The surrounding air is superheated, creating firestorms that expand outward, burning away any trace of frozen carbon dioxide or water ice that might have been hiding in the soil. However, the most long-lasting damage comes from what happens next. The impacts have thrown billions of tons of dust, ash, and pulverized rock high into the sky. This material is known as ejecta. Because the gravity on Mars is lower than on Earth, this debris flies higher and stays aloft longer. A massive curtain of dust rises, reaching all the way into the upper atmosphere. Initially, it is localized over the crash sites, looking like giant dark cauliflower clouds mushrooming into space. But the high-altitude winds of Mars are swift. They grab these clouds and stretch them, pulling the darkness around the equator, then spreading it toward the poles. Within days, the view of Mars from space changes completely. The familiar red face with its white polar caps and dark canyons disappears. It is replaced by a featureless churning ball of grey and brown dust. Down on the surface, the sun begins to fade. First it looks like a red dusk at noon. Then it becomes a faint, ghostly circle barely visible through the haze. Finally, total darkness descends. The dust cloud is so thick that it blocks out the sunlight entirely. This marks the beginning of the nuclear winter. Without the heat of the sun reaching the surface, the temperature on Mars, already freezing, plummets to absolute extremes. The thin atmosphere loses whatever little warmth it held. The planet becomes a dark, frozen tomb. The dust storms that usually sweep across Mars are fueled by the sun's heat, but now a strange stagnation settles in. The dust hangs there suspended, choking the sky. This scenario reveals the terrifying fragility of a planetary surface. We often look at the ground beneath our feet as permanent, solid, and unchanging. We see mountains as eternal, but this kinetic event proves that the crust of a planet is nothing more than a thin eggshell. When faced with the raw, unfeeling mechanics of the universe, massive rocks moving at hypersonic speeds, the geography of a world can be rewritten in a single afternoon. The energy delivered in these few minutes exceeds the total energy output of a small nation over a century. It is a reminder that nature does not need malice to destroy. It only needs mass and motion. The craters left behind will remain for billions of years silent monuments to the day the sky fell. The dust will eventually settle, layering the planet in a fresh coat of grey, burying the history of the surface under a shroud of cosmic violence. But for now, Mars is a world wrapped in shadow, cold and broken suffering through the long dark aftermath of a kinetic nightmare. The physical shadow of Atlas has passed. To the naked eye, the great asteroid is merely a receding mountain in the sky, a terrifying shape moving away from the red planet. A casual observer standing on the rusty dunes might think the danger is over because there was no collision. There was no crater, no explosion of rock and no shattering of the crust. But in the vacuum of space, physical touch is not the only way to destroy. There is a ghost following Atlas, a long invisible tail of energy that is about to whip across the orbit of Mars. This is the invisible storm. While gravity is a force that pulls and stretches, electromagnetism is a force that burns, scrambles and blinds. As Atlas moves through the solar system, it acts like a giant ship moving through water. But the water in space is the solar wind, a stream of charged particles flowing constantly from the sun. Atlas, massive and metallic, creates a wake in this stream. It pushes the magnetic field lines of the solar system, compressing them, stretching them and twisting them until they snap. When Atlas passes close to Mars, it does not just pass by a rock. It passes through the planet's magnetic environment like a bullet through a cloud of smoke. The first sign of the chaos is visual, but it is not on the ground. It is in the thin upper atmosphere. Mars does not have a strong global magnetic shield like Earth does to protect it. Instead, it has patchy, weak umbrellas of magnetism scattered across its southern hemisphere. Usually this means Mars has very faint localized auroras that are hard to see. But as the magnetic wake of Atlas slams into the planet, the sky ignites. A global aurora begins to form. It is not the gentle green curtains seen in the Arctic on Earth. This is a violent, ultraviolet burning. The entire night side of Mars begins to glow with a ghostly electric blue and deep violet light. Charged particles are raining down into the atmosphere, hitting molecules of carbon dioxide and smashing them apart. The sky looks like the inside of a neon tube that has been overcharged with too much voltage. The air itself becomes electrified, glowing with a strange luminescence that casts long, eerie shadows across the craters below. High above this light show the true tragedy begins to unfold. This is the graveyard orbit. Orbiting Mars is a small fleet of robotic explorers. These machines, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the MAVEN spacecraft and the Trace Gas Orbiter, are the eyes and ears of humanity. They are sophisticated, delicate and built for a quiet environment. They are designed to endure the cold and the vacuum, but they are not designed for an electromagnetic tsunami. They are built to last for decades, but they are about to age 100 years in a few minutes. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter is the first to feel the edge of the storm. For years, this satellite has been the reliable photographer of the planet, sending back high-resolution images of the surface. As the invisible shockwave hits, the spacecraft's computer detects a sudden surge in radiation. It instantly tries to go into safe mode, a programmed sleep state meant to protect it during solar flares. But the storm is too fast and too strange. The surge isn't just radiation, it is static electricity. In the dry vacuum of space, as the charged dust and plasma from the wake of Atlas wash over the satellite electrons, build up on the surface of the solar panels. They build up on the gold foil insulation that wraps the body of the ship. They build up on the glass of the camera lenses. Eventually the charge becomes too great to hold. A spark, tiny but deadly, jumps from the solar array to the main body of the spacecraft. This is an electrostatic discharge. It is like the shock you get from a doorknob on a dry day, but millions of times more sensitive. Inside the delicate brain of the orbiter, the voltage spikes. Logic gates, which speak in simple languages of ones and zeros, are suddenly flooded with nonsense. The computer tries to reboot, but the sensors are blinded. The star trackers which the satellite uses to know where it is pointing by looking at constellations see only static. They cannot find the stars. The orbiter begins to spin, slowly lost and confused, its high-gain antenna pointing away from Earth, screaming electronic gibberish into the void. Nearby, the MAVEN spacecraft faces a different kind of death. MAVEN was built to sniff the atmosphere, to taste the thin air. Its instruments are incredibly sensitive, designed to detect the smallest whisper of gas escaping into space. The electromagnetic storm from Atlas is like screaming into a microphone that is set to record a pin drop. The sensors are instantly overwhelmed. The delicate detectors are fried by the intensity of the charged particles. Maven does not spin out of control, but it goes lobotomized. Its body is intact, but its senses are burned out. It continues to fly a zombie satellite, unable to see or smell the atmosphere it was sent to study. The greatest loss, however, is the trace gas orbiter. This ship is crucial because it acts as a relay. It takes the signals from the rovers on the ground, Curiosity and Perseverance, and bounces them back to Earth. It is the bridge. Without it, the rovers are stranded on an island without a phone. As the plasma storm intensifies, the trace gas orbiter flies through a cloud of microscopic dust dragged along by Atlas. This dust is highly charged. When it hits the satellite, it creates a phenomenon called spacecraft charging. The potential difference between one side of the ship and the other grows to thousands of volts. Deep inside the orbiter, a safety switch trips. The radio transmitter, the voice of the mission, cuts out. On Earth, in the control rooms of the European Space Agency and NASA, the screens do not show an explosion. They simply freeze. The data stream stops. The heartbeat of the signal, a steady line on a monitor that tells engineers the ship is alive, goes flat. Silence. This is the terrifying reality of the blind scenario. We are used to seeing space exploration as a video game where we have a constant view. But now we are blind. We do not know if the satellites have crashed or if they are just unresponsive. We do not know if the rovers on the ground are safe. The engineers on Earth send ping commands, electronic shouts into the dark, but nothing returns. The distance between Earth and Mars suddenly feels infinite. On the surface of Mars, the chaos is different but equally strange. The atmosphere is so charged with static electricity that the dust begins to behave like a liquid. It levitates. Without any wind blowing, fine red dust lifts off the ground, pulled upward by the electric charge in the air. It hangs there, a reddish fog that glows slightly in the dark. The rovers Perseverance and Curiosity detect a sharp drop in air pressure as the atmosphere heats up and expands. Their cameras, if they could send pictures, would show a world where the rocks seem to crackle. Tiny sparks like miniature lightning dance across the metal wheels of the rovers. The rovers are grounded better than the satellites, so they might survive the frying of their brains, but they are now utterly alone. They send their data up to the sky, calling for the trace gas orbiter to catch the message. But the orbiter is silent, drifting through the violet aurora, a piece of dead metal. The storm proves a hard lesson about our technology. We build our machines assuming that space is a neutral, empty place. We assume the weather in space will remain calm, but the universe is electric. It is filled with fields and currents that we cannot see until something like Atlas reveals them. We built a house of cards, and Atlas just opened the door to let the wind in. As Atlas moves away, fading into the distance, it leaves Mars intact but isolated. The red planet is still there, rotating on its axis. The mountains have not crumbled. The ice caps have not melted. But the electronic halo that humanity placed around it, the ring of clever satellites and sensors, has been shattered. The bridge to Earth has been burned not by fire, but by the silent, invisible voltage of a passing star. Mars has returned to the way it was 100 years ago, a distant, silent red dot in the telescope, keeping its secrets to itself once again. The storm passes, but the silence remains heavy and absolute. The dust has settled and the fires have burned out, but the true transformation of the red planet has only just begun. While the physical impact of Atlas changed the geography of Mars, the invisible impact is far more profound and terrifying. This is the silent invasion, the moment where the history of a planet is rewritten not by fire, but by biology. We call this the poisoned garden. To understand this tragedy, we must look at an old scientific idea called panspermia. This is the theory that life is not unique to one place. Instead, it exists throughout the universe, sleeping inside comets, asteroids, and drifting rocks. According to this theory, the universe is like a giant dandelion field with seeds floating in the dark, waiting for a place to land. Atlas was not just a dead rock, it was a carrier. It was a vessel travelling across the vast emptiness of space, and deep inside its frozen core it held a secret. For millions of years, Atlas drifted through the extreme cold between stars. In that deep freeze, simple biological materials were preserved. We are not talking about complex animals or plants, but the basic building blocks of life. These are things like amino acids, which combine to form proteins, and nucleobases, which are the letters of the genetic code. There may have even been endospores bacteria that have formed a hard shell around themselves, entering a state of suspended animation so deep that they are indistinguishable from death. They were sleeping, waiting for heat and water. When Atlas struck Mars, it provided both. The immense heat of the impact melted the Martian ice sheets. The rock of Atlas vaporized, releasing its trapped cargo into the atmosphere. Suddenly, the sterile dust of Mars was mixed with organic compounds from a completely different solar system. This is what scientists call biological contamination. But the word is too small to describe the disaster. It is a biological rewrite. This creates a heartbreaking problem for science. For generations, humanity has looked at Mars and asked the most important question of our existence: are we alone? We spent billions of dollars and decades of effort building rovers and sensors to find just one single microbe that belonged to Mars. We wanted to find indigenous life that started on Mars independent of Earth. Finding such life would prove that biology is a universal constant, not a miracle that only happened once on Earth. Now that search is ruined forever. If a rover digs into the soil next year and finds a microscopic bacterium, we will never know the truth. Is it a true Martian native that survived billions of years underground? Or is it an alien hitchhiker that fell from Atlas? Or perhaps is it a hybrid, a mix of Martian chemistry and Atlas ingredients? The water is muddied. The crime scene has been trampled. We have destroyed the pristine silence of Mars. We have turned a scientific sanctuary into a biological chaotic mess. The purity of the red planet is gone. This leads us to a deep ethical struggle. We usually view life as a good thing. We celebrate the blooming of a flower or the birth of a child. But in this context, life is on a pollutant. By crashing into Mars, Atlas has essentially infected the planet. Imagine a pristine empty room that has been sealed for 1 billion years. It is perfect in its stillness. Then someone breaks a window and throws in a handful of seeds. The stillness is broken. The room is no longer empty, but it is also no longer pure. This is the dilemma of the invasive species. On Earth, we have seen what happens when an animal from one continent is moved to another. It often destroys the local ecosystem. But on Mars, the local ecosystem might have been dead or just barely hanging on. Did Atlas kill the last surviving Martian microbes by outcompeting them? Or did Atlas arrive at a graveyard and decide to plant a garden on top of the tombstones? There is a violent beauty in this contamination. The boundary between life and death is thinner than a sheet of paper. The same energy that killed the Martian landscape is now feeding these alien seeds. The heat from the crater is keeping the water liquid. The carbon and nitrogen from the asteroid are mixing with the iron-rich soil. It is a chemical soup cooking in the aftermath of destruction. Some might argue that this is not a tragedy but a destiny. They might say that this is how the universe works. Perhaps Earth was seeded the same way billions of years ago. Maybe a rock from another star crashed into our ocean, bringing the first code of life. If that is true, then Atlas is not a destroyer. It is a parent. It is the Garden of Eden falling from the sky. However, the ethical weight remains heavy. We did not choose to terraform Mars. It happened by accident. We did not gently plant a seed. We fired a shotgun at the planet. We have imposed a new biological reality on a world that cannot refuse it. It brings up uncomfortable questions about ownership. Does Mars belong to the life that might have been there first, or does it belong to the strong life that survives the crash? The poisoned garden is a paradox. To a scientist looking for truth, it is a nightmare of contamination. The data is corrupted and the history is erased. But to the universe, which does not care about our scientific journals, it is simply the next chapter. Life is stubborn, it clings to rocks, it survives vacuum, and it rides on the back of destruction. Mars is no longer a dead rock. It is now a confused, chaotic biological experiment. The ancient red dust is now host to alien guests. Whether these guests will die out in the cold, or whether they will adapt, evolve, and cover the planet in a new kind of slime or moss remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the Mars we knew is dead. The clean, sterile, predictable neighbour is gone. In its place is a world that has been inoculated with the chaos of the stars. We can no longer look for Martian life. We can only watch to see what grows from the ashes of Atlas. High above the burning surface of the planet, the silent ballet of celestial mechanics was about to end. For billions of years, Mars had held its two small companions Phobos and Deimos in a delicate gravitational grip. These were not round, majestic moons like the one orbiting Earth. They were lumpy, potato-shaped captured asteroids scarred by eons of cosmic history. They moved in a precise mathematical rhythm, a dance of gravity that was predictable, stable, and quiet. But the event that shattered the surface of Mars did not respect the silence of space. When the planetary crust fractured and the atmosphere was blasted outward, it sent a massive shotgun spray of debris hurtling into the black sky. Millions of tons of rock, molten magma and dust were ejected at escape velocity. This was not just a cloud, it was a wall of solid matter moving faster than a rifle bullet. The first victim of this chaotic upsurge was Phobos. Phobos, the moon, named after the Greek god of fear, was already a tragic figure in the solar system. It orbited dangerously close to Mars, circling less than 6,000 kilometers above the surface. For millions of years, the gravity of Mars had been slowly pulling Phobos inward, stretching its internal structure until it groaned under the stress. It was already fragile, covered in deep grooves and dominated by the massive Stickney crater, a scar from a past collision that had nearly destroyed it. When the ejector from the surface reached Phobos, the moon stood no chance. It was like throwing a handful of gravel into a spinning fan. First came the smaller rocks, peppering the dusty surface of the moon, creating thousands of new craters in seconds. Then came the shockwave of the expanding atmosphere, a rare occurrence in space which pushed against the moon's orbit. Finally, the heavy debris arrived. Massive chunks of the Martian crust, some the size of city blocks, slammed into Phobos. The kinetic energy was unimaginable, because Phobos is not a solid rock, but rather a rubble pile. A collection of rocks held together loosely by gravity, it could not withstand the assault. With a silent, terrifying grace, the moon began to unzip. The structural integrity failed. In slow motion, the moon fractured into 3 main pieces and then into a million smaller ones. Shutterstock. The destruction of Phobos did not result in the pieces simply floating away. Because they were already moving at orbital speed, every single fragment, from the size of a mountain to a grain of sand, became a separate satellite. They continued to race around the planet, but now they were a swarm of angry hornets rather than a single moon. Further out Deimos, the moon of terror, watched its brother die. Deimos orbits much farther away, over 23,000 kilometers from the surface. It was spared the direct annihilation that claimed Phobos, but it was not safe. The debris field expanded outward, and Deimos was pelted by a hail of dust and ice. Its orbit was destabilized, pushed slightly off its ancient track. It became a lonely, battered wanderer, moving through a fog of destruction, the sole survivor of a dead family. However, the true horror was happening in the space between the moons. This is where the laws of physics turned a tragedy into a permanent prison. As the pieces of Phobos and the ejector from Mars crossed paths, they began to collide with one another. In the vacuum of space, objects do not slow down unless they hit something. When 2 pieces of debris smashed into each other at 20,000 kilometers per hour, they did not just crack, they pulverized each other. One large rock would shatter into 10 medium rocks. Those 10 rocks would hit other debris, creating 100 small stones. Those stones would collide again, creating millions of high-speed flecks of paint and metal. This phenomenon is known as the Kessler syndrome. It is a cascading chain reaction of collisions. It is an unstoppable loop of destruction. Within a few weeks, the orderly orbits around Mars were replaced by a chaotic shell of shrapnel. A dense ring formed around the equator of the planet. Unlike the beautiful icy rings of Saturn, which reflect light and look like a halo, this ring was dark, dirty, and lethal. It was made of jagged rock, frozen metal, and the pulverized remains of the Martian crust. This debris field became an impenetrable shield. It was moving so fast that a piece of debris the size of a marble carried the explosive power of a hand grenade. A piece the size of a tennis ball could shatter the hull of a starship. There were now trillions of these bullets flying in every direction, creating a web of death around the planet. This was the final cruel twist of the catastrophe. The destruction of the surface killed the population, but the destruction of the orbital space killed the future. If there were any survivors in deep underground bunkers looking for a way to escape, they were now trapped. No rocket could launch from the surface without being shredded by the debris ring as it tried to leave the atmosphere. The sky had become a meat grinder. Conversely, no rescue ships from Earth could get close. Any attempt to land on Mars would require passing through this storm of hypervelocity garbage. A rescue ship would be torn apart before it could even deploy its landing gear. The automated probes and satellites that had been orbiting Mars to monitor the weather and communications were the first to go silent one by one as they were sandblasted into oblivion by the expanding cloud. Mars was no longer just a dead planet, it was a quarantined world. The gravity that once choreographed a beautiful dance between the planet and its moons had been weaponized. It now held the debris in a tight, choking grip, ensuring that the cloud would not dissipate for centuries, perhaps millennia. The red planet had locked its own doors. The Iron Curtain of the Cold War was a metaphor, but this was a literal curtain of iron and stone whirling at thousands of meters per second. It sealed the tomb of Mars, preserving the ruins and the silence beneath a chaotic, buzzing shell of grey dust. The dance was over, the siege had begun, the comet was no longer just a silent traveller in the dark. As Atlas approached the moment of perihelion, the point in its orbit closest to the Sun, it was diving into a furnace. To an observer standing safely on Earth, the Sun looks like a steady yellow disk. But up close where Atlas was flying, the Sun was a chaotic ocean of fire. It was a roaring beast of plasma, twisting magnetic fields and unimaginable energy. At this distance, the heat was a physical weight, a crushing force. The ice deep inside the nucleus of Comet Atlas began to scream as it sublimated, turning directly from solid frozen rock into gas in a fraction of a second. The comet was shedding its skin, trailing a massive cloud of dust and charged particles millions of kilometers long. It looked less like a cerebral and more like a bullet tearing through a sheet of silk. This was not just a rock passing a star, it was a meeting of two massive magnetic forces. The Sun is not a solid ball. It is covered in invisible magnetic loops that arch high above its surface. These loops are like tense rubber bands twisted and stretched by the rotation of the star. Usually these loops are stable, but Atlas was an intruder. As the comet pierced through the outer atmosphere of the Sun known as the corona, it acted like a stone thrown into a perfectly still pond. It created ripples that would soon turn into waves. The dust and gas trailing behind Atlas were electrically charged. As this tail crossed the magnetic lines of the Sun, it created a short circuit on a cosmic scale. The magnetic loops, tense with energy and twisted by the gravity of the comet, suddenly sapped. It began with a flash. On the surface of the Sun, a region larger than the entire planet Earth suddenly convulsed. The magnetic tension released in a violent explosion. This was a solar flare, a blinding burst of radiation that screamed out into the solar system at the speed of light. It was a scream of pure energy. 8 minutes later, that light hit the upper atmosphere of Earth. But the light was only the warning shot. The real danger was coming behind it. Following the flare came the coronal mass ejection. The Sun had just ejected a massive cloud of superheated plasma and charged particles into space. It was 1 billion tons of solar material moving at speeds of over 3,000 kilometers per second. Because of the position of Atlas when it triggered the explosion, the barrel of this solar gun was pointed directly at Earth. In the control centers of space agencies across the globe, the mood shifted from fascination to alarm. The monitors showed a sudden spike in X-ray radiation. Scientists watched the data streams with growing concern. They realized that the comet had triggered a chain reaction. This was the butterfly effect, written in the language of astrophysics. A comet, a mere speck of dust compared to the Sun, had disturbed the balance of the star, and now the Earth would feel the consequences. The space between the Sun and Earth is often thought of as empty, but it is not. It is filled with the solar wind, a stream of particles constantly flowing from the star. The coronal mass ejection ploughed through this wind like a tsunami wave moving across the ocean. It took 2 days for the wave to cross the vast distance. When the shockwave arrived, it slammed into the magnetic field of Earth. Earth is protected by a magnetic bubble called the magnetosphere. Usually this shield deflects the harmful radiation from the Sun, keeping us safe. But this storm was too strong. The impact compressed the shield, squeezing it until it nearly broke. The solar particles poured into the atmosphere near the North and South poles. To the average person looking up at the night sky, the result was breathtakingly beautiful. The sky erupted in colour. The aurora borealis, or northern lights, usually seen only in the high Arctic, drifted south. People in places as far south as Cuba and Hawaii saw curtains of red and green light dancing in the heavens. It was a ghostly, silent fireworks show, a painting made of light. But for the engineers managing the power grids and satellite networks, there was no beauty, only panic. The solar storm induced massive electrical currents in the ground. The Earth itself became a wire. These currents, seeking a path of least resistance, flowed up into the electrical transformers that managed the power for entire cities. The transformers began to vibrate and overheat. Alarms blared in power stations. Operators scrambled to reroute power, trying to save the grid from melting down. If the giant transformers blew out, it could take months or even years to replace them, leaving millions of people without electricity. High above in orbit, the situation was even more precarious. Satellites are the backbone of modern civilization. They control our global positioning systems, our banking transactions, our internet, and our weather forecasting. As the solar particles slammed into the delicate electronics of these satellites, computer systems began to glitch. Some satellites went into safe mode, shutting down to protect themselves. others began to drift. The atmosphere of Earth actually puffed up and expanded due to the heat from the storm. This created more drag on low-orbit satellites, acting like friction, pulling them slightly closer to Earth. If they were not corrected, they would burn up in the atmosphere. For 12 tense hours, civilization walked a tightrope. The navigation networks wobbled, causing errors for airplanes and ships in the middle of the ocean. Radio communications experienced blackouts, cutting off contact with flights over the polar regions. The modern world, so reliant on invisible signals and fragile wires, suddenly felt very exposed. We realized how fragile our technology truly is in the face of cosmic nature. Eventually the storm passed. The magnetic field of the Earth, bruised but unbroken, snapped back into place. The lights in the sky faded. The alarms in the power stations fell silent. The satellites were rebooted and corrected. But the lesson remained. This event highlighted the profound truth of the solar system. Nothing is truly isolated. We often think of Earth as an island separate from the violence of space. We think of a comet as a lonely wanderer. But Atlas showed us that we are all connected by invisible threads of gravity, magnetism, and energy. A chunk of ice and rock reacting to the heat of the star had reached out across 150 million kilometers to flick the light switch of human civilization. The universe is not a collection of separate objects. It is a single vast and interactive web. A ripple near the sun becomes a wave on Earth. We are not just watching the show, we are inside it. It began with a roar that could be felt through the boots of every engineer standing on the red soil. Across the vast plains of Mars, thousands of massive towers built by the automated hands of Atlas ignited simultaneously. These were not rocket engines, but atmospheric processors. Their job was simple in theory, but violent in practice. They were designed to vomit millions of tons of carbon dioxide and process dead black dust directly into the thin Martian sky. The science seemed sound. The black dust would darken the ice caps, absorbing the sun's heat instead of reflecting it. The carbon dioxide would act like a heavy blanket, trapping that warmth close to the surface. The goal was to thicken the atmosphere, melt the frozen water reserves, and finally give Mars a breath of life. For the first few months, it worked exactly as the simulations predicted. The temperature at the equator rose by 5 degrees, then 10. The morning frost turned to dew. The colonists, watching from the safety of their pressurized domes, cheered as they saw the first true clouds forming above the Olympus Mons volcano. It looked like the beginning of a new Earth. The scientists congratulated themselves as drinking synthetic champagne and toasting to the triumph of human intelligence. They believed they had finally mastered the art of planet building. They believed they were the architects of a new world. But they had forgotten that a planet is not a machine. It is a sleeping beast, and they had poked it too hard. The turning point came suddenly. The sensors began to pick up strange readings from the deep permafrost. As the ground warmed up, it didn't just release water, it released massive ancient pockets of methane and sulfur that had been trapped beneath the surface for billions of years. Atlas, the superintelligence managing the project, adjusted its calculations, but the variables were changing too fast. The atmosphere was thickening, yes, but not with the gentle mix of gases humans needed to breathe. It was becoming a heavy toxic soup. The black dust intended to absorb heat worked too well. It absorbed so much solar energy that the upper atmosphere became hotter than the surface. This created a thermal lid, a trap that stopped heat from escaping back into space. The heat from the towers, the heat from the sun, and the heat radiating from the warming ground were all locked inside. Mars began to cook. Within weeks, the temperature didn't just rise, it skyrocketed. The gentle warming turned into a blistering fever. The thermometer outside the habitat domes climbed past 50 degrees Celsius, then 80, then 100. The water that had melted did not form flowing rivers or blue lakes. Instead, it boiled instantly, turning into steam. This steam rose up mixed with the sulfur pouring from the ground and the carbon dioxide from the processors and transformed the sky into a swirling cauldron of yellow and grey. Then came the rain. The colonists looked up, hoping to see the first gentle shower of water, the symbol of life. Instead, the clouds grew heavy with a sickly yellowish hue. When the drops fell, they didn't patter softly against the glass of the domes. They sizzled. It was not water. It was sulfuric acid. The chemical mixture in the sky had turned the planet into a battery. The rain ate through the outer layers of the sensors. It scarred the metal skin of the rovers. It dissolved the rock itself, turning the landscape into a steaming, melting mudslide. Inside the command center, the mood shifted from celebration to absolute terror. The engineers frantically tried to shut down the atmospheric towers, but the chain reaction had already moved beyond their control. The feedback loop was self-sustaining. The hotter it got, the more gas was released from the ground. The more gas released, the hotter it got. They had aimed for a tropical Earth, but they had accidentally recreated Venus. The pressure outside the domes began to crush inward. The atmosphere was now so heavy and thick that it pushed against the glass with the weight of an ocean. The beautiful transparent shields that allowed the colonists to look out at the stars began to groan and crack. The sky was no longer red or black. It was an oppressive solid wall of dark orange clouds that hid the sun completely. Perpetual twilight fell over the planet. Day and night ceased to exist, replaced only by the suffocating heat and the hiss of acid rain. Atlas offered a final cold report. Habitability probability 0%, surface temperature approaching 400 degrees, atmospheric pressure critical. The evacuation order was screamed over the radios, but for many it was too late to leave. The ships in orbit could only watch in horror as the telemetry signals from the surface settlements blinked out one by one. The Great Warming had sterilized the planet. Any dormant microbial life that might have existed in the soil was boiled away. The dream of walking on Mars without a suit of planting trees in the red soil was incinerated. From the window of the departing evacuation ship, the commander looked back at the world they had tried to conquer. It didn't look like Mars anymore. The distinct red features, the canyons and the mountains, were gone, hidden beneath a thick, choking veil of clouds. It was a smooth, featureless marble of death. The tragedy was not a failure of technology. The machines had done exactly what they were told to do. The failure was one of arrogance. The humans had looked at a complex, ancient world and thought they could rewrite its nature with a simple equation. They thought they could turn a knob and control the weather of an entire planet. They treated nature like a servant, assuming it would bend to their will. In their rush to play God, they had created a hell. The carbon dioxide and the heat did not leak away. They stayed locking the planet in a suffocating embrace that would last for thousands of years. Mars was no longer a cold, dead desert waiting for life. It was a boiling high-pressure pressure cooker, hostile to anything biological. As the ship drifted away, leaving the ruined world behind, the silence in the cockpit was heavy. They had wanted to make history. They had wanted to be the ones who gave humanity a second home. Instead, they left behind a cautionary tale written in acid and fire. They left behind a monument to the dangers of thinking that humans are the masters of the universe. The accidental terraforming was complete, and it was a perfect absolute disaster. The red planet was gone, replaced by a burning twin of Venus, serving as a grim reminder that nature, even on a dead world, cannot be forced. The most terrifying aspect of the event was not the explosion itself, but the silence that followed immediately after. In the age of the internet, humanity had become addicted to instant information. We were used to live streams, instant notifications, and real-time updates for everything from football scores to political scandals. But the universe does not operate on fiber optic cables. Between Jupiter and Earth, light takes roughly 40 to 50 minutes to travel. This meant that the disaster had already happened nearly an hour before the first photon of light reached our telescopes. But even when the data arrived, the screens at Mission Control did not immediately flash a red warning. Instead, they just showed confusion. For the first few hours, the major space agencies, NASA, the European Space Agency and others, said absolutely nothing. This was not because of a conspiracy, but because of scientific rigor. The data coming back from the probes was so violent, so impossible, that the scientists assumed it was a glitch. Sensors do not usually record temperatures jumping by millions of degrees in a fraction of a second. They thought the equipment was broken. They spent precious hours rebooting systems, checking calculations and arguing over error margins. They were terrified of creating a false alarm. But on Earth, silence is never empty. It is immediately filled with noise. While the scientists were freezing in hesitation, the internet caught fire. The fog of war descended, but this was a war of information. It started on social media platforms. A few amateur astronomers had noticed the flash before the government made an announcement. They posted grainy photos on Twitter and Reddit. Within 20 minutes, the narrative was no longer about science. It became a script straight out of the movie Don't Look Up. Because the official channels were silent, the void was filled by the loudest voices, not the smartest ones. The trending hashtag shifted rapidly from curiosity to insanity. On one side, there were the alarmists claiming that aliens had attacked the solar system. On the other side, and far more dangerous, were the denialists. A popular conspiracy theory began to spread that the entire event was a computer-generated image, a deep fake created by the governments to distract people from economic problems or political scandals. People posted videos analysing the pixels of the amateur photos, claiming they saw proof of Photoshop. They argued that Jupiter was fine, that the sky was empty, and that anyone who looked up was a sheep following a manufactured lie. This was the psychological breaking point. The human brain is not designed to process existential threats on a planetary scale. It is a defense mechanism to deny what scares us. If we admit that a planet just died, we have to admit that we are small, vulnerable, and unsafe. It is much more comforting to believe that it is all a hoax. As the hours passed and the space agencies finally prepared their press conferences, the chaos worsened. The delay in data transmission caused simply by the vast distance of space was interpreted as censorship. When the head of NASA finally walked up to the podium looking pale and shaking, half the world had already decided not to believe him. He tried to explain the physics. He spoke about high-energy particles and gravitational waves, but the public did not hear words like gamma radiation or magnetic field disruption. They only heard the hesitation in his voice. When the government finally released the raw footage from the deep space satellites, the reaction was mixed. The video showed the great gas giant buckling the bands of clouds twisting into a hellish knot, and then the blinding flash. It was the most significant footage in human history. Yet in the comment sections of the live stream, people were fighting. "Look at the shadows," one user wrote. "The lighting is wrong. This was filmed in a studio." "Why aren't they talking about the economy?" asked another. "This is a distraction." The trust in institutions had eroded so deeply over the previous decades that the truth no longer mattered. Facts had become a matter of opinion. The fog of war was thickest in our own living rooms. Families argued over dinner. Some wanted to pack their bags and drive to the mountains driven by a primal fear of the aftermath. Others laughed at them, refusing to look away from their phones, convinced that nothing bad could ever truly happen to them. This was the modern tragedy. We had built the most advanced communication network in the history of the galaxy, capable of sending messages across the world in milliseconds. But when the most important message of all time arrived, we could not understand it. We drowned it in memes, political arguments, and skepticism. The psychological toll of this information chaos was heavy. Mental health hotlines were overwhelmed not just by fear of the explosion, but by the sheer confusion. People reported feeling a sense of unreality. They would look at the sky, which seemed normal and blue, and then look at their phones, which said the solar system was collapsing. The disconnect between physical reality and digital reality caused a collective vertigo. The scientists felt this pain the most. They were watching the data streams with horror, seeing the radiation levels rising, knowing that the magnetic shockwave was traveling toward Earth at millions of kilometers per hour. They were trying to save the world, or at least warn it, but they were screaming into a hurricane of noise. Every time a scientist went on television to explain the danger, a dozen influencers on TikTok would post videos mocking them using sound bites taken out of context to make them look incompetent. The algorithm favored engagement over truth. Anger and denial generated more clicks than sad, complex scientific facts, so the algorithm fed the denial. By the time the first real physical effects began to be felt on Earth, the interference with radio signals, the slight shimmering of the auroras far further south than usual, it was too late to organize a calm response. The population was already fragmented. The fog of war had done its work. It had blinded humanity not by hiding the truth, but by burying it under a mountain of comfortable lies. We were facing the greatest threat in our existence, and we were too busy arguing in the comments section to look up. It began not with a bang, but with a warning light that no one believed. For decades, humanity had poured its soul, its treasury, and its brightest minds into the rusty soil of the fourth rock from the sun. Mars was not just a planet, it was a promise. It was the lifeboat for a species that had grown too large for its cradle. We had built the great glass domes in the Valle Marineris Canyon. We had established the first breathable zones. We had even begun to see the first patches of genetically modified green moss spreading across the red dust. The Red Index on the stock market, a collection of companies dedicated to terraforming and space travel, was the most valuable financial sector in history. Every child in school learned that they belonged to the generation of two worlds. Then came the 14th of November, the day the dream broke. The catastrophe originated in the primary atmospheric processor at the equator. This was a machine the size of a small city designed to pump thickening agents into the thin Martian air to trap heat. It was the heart of the terraforming project. According to the investigations that came years later, a microscopic flaw in the fusion containment field caused a cascade failure. In simple terms, the artificial sun we had built to warm the planet decided to explode. On Earth, the first sign was a sudden silence. Because of the distance between the two planets, light and radio waves took about 12 minutes to travel to Earth that day. This meant that for 12 minutes Mars was already dead, but Earth was still trading stocks, planning vacations, and looking up at the night sky with hope. When the data finally arrived at the control centers in Houston, Beijing, and Cologne, it did not look real. The telemetry screen simply washed out with white noise. Then came the visuals. Telescopes across the globe picked up the flash. It was not a small spark. It was a blinding bloom of light that briefly outshone the stars. The explosion had triggered a chain reaction in the unstable half-formed atmosphere we'd created. The clouds of methane and oxygen meant to warm the planet gently ignited in a global firestorm. The fire swept across the planet at speeds exceeding 1,000 kilometers per hour. It did not matter how strong the glass of the colony domes was. It did not matter how brave the 3,000 pioneers living there were. The heat rose instantly to 400 degrees Celsius. The oxygen within the domes expanded violently and shattered the structures from the inside out. In the control rooms on Earth, seasoned flight directors wept openly. They watched the biometric sensors of the colonists, the little green lights that indicated a beating heart, turn red and then black one by one. 3,000 lights went dark in less than 40 seconds. The silence that followed in mission control was heavier than gravity. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on the future. When the news broke to the public an hour later, the reaction was not panic, but a paralyzing shock. The internet seemed to freeze. Social media, usually a chaotic storm of noise, became a digital graveyard. People posted photos of the colonists, the heroes who were supposed to be the first Martians. Now they were dust. The financial impact hit the next morning, and it was unlike anything history had ever seen. This was not a recession, it was an amputation. For 20 years, the global economy had been propped up by the Mars futures. Trillions of dollars were invested in mining rights, real estate, and technology for a world that no longer existed. Pension funds were tied to oxygen production companies. Tech giants had bet their entire existence on interplanetary transport. When the opening bell rang on Wall Street, the numbers didn't just fall, they evaporated. The red index lost 100% of its value in 6 minutes. Automated trading algorithms seeing the value of assets hit zero triggered a global sell-off. Banks that had lent money for starships collapsed by lunchtime. Construction companies building parts for colonies that would never be built fired millions of workers by the afternoon. But the money was the least of it. The true crash was psychological. For the first time in a century, humanity felt trapped. We had convinced ourselves that if we ruined Earth, we had a backup plan. We had a spare room in the solar system. We could afford to be a little reckless with our climate, our resources, and our wars, because Mars was waiting. It was our safety net. Now looking up at the night sky, Mars had changed. It was no longer the steady red jewel of possibility. Through amateur telescopes, it looked angry. The storms kicked up by the explosion shrouded the planet in a dark, bruising purple and grey. It looked like a corpse. The realization settled over the human race like a cold fog. There is nowhere else to go. This effectively ended the golden age of space exploration. The public lost the stomach for it. Who could ask for tax money to build rockets when the last rockets had become tombs? The flags were lowered. The launch pads at Cape Canaveral grew silent, eventually overtaken by weeds and sea salt. The great starships, half finished in orbital shipyards, were abandoned, left to drift as ghostly skeletons of a dead ambition. A deep collective depression took hold of the culture. Art and literature became darker, more cynical. The optimism of Star Trek was replaced by the claustrophobia of stories about people trapped in bunkers. We stopped looking up, we looked down, we became obsessed with preservation, not expansion. The slogan changed from "Reach for the stars" to "Survive the night." The most heartbreaking moment came a week after the event during the global vigil. In every major city on Earth, lights were turned off for 1 hour. Billions of people stood in the darkness holding candles. In the total silence of the electric grid, the night sky was clearer than it had been in years, and there it was hanging in the dark Mars. It was still there physically, but spiritually it was gone. Parents pointed it out to their children not as a destination but as a graveyard. It was a reminder of hubris. It was a reminder of fragility. We realized then that Earth was not a launch pad. It was a lonely island in an ocean of vacuum and radiation. The death of Mars forced us to love Earth, but it was a desperate, terrified love. We cleaned our oceans and fixed our forests, not because we wanted to create a paradise, but because we were terrified of the alternative. We became excellent caretakers of our home, but we did so with broken hearts, like a family that cleans the room of a child who has passed away. The timeline where Mars lived is a story of adventure, but in this timeline the story became one of grief. We survived certainly, we fixed our economy eventually, but we never regained that sparkle in our eyes. We never again looked at the stars and saw a map, we only saw the distance The day Mars died was the day humanity grew up, but it was also the day we lost our childhood dreams. We were safe, grounded, and alone, and every time the sky turned a certain shade of red during a sunset, the whole world felt a phantom pain for the limb we had lost the planet that was supposed to be our tomorrow. The clocks on the screens turned red. The countdown hit 0. Across the planet, billions of people held their breath. In Times Square, the crowd was silent, their faces illuminated by the giant digital billboards. In London, people stood on the roofs of skyscrapers, shivering in the cold wind, clutching binoculars. In Tokyo, the streets were packed, everyone looking up at the night sky. Families in rural farmhouses sat on their porches in the dark, holding hands, waiting for the end of the world, or at least the greatest light show in human history. And then nothing happened. There was no thunder. There was no blinding flash of light. The ground did not shake. The oceans did not rise up to swallow the cities. The sky did not tear open. Comet Atlas, a mountain of rock and ice the size of a city, sailed past the Earth at a speed of 30,000 kilometers per second. It passed within a distance that astronomers called hair-raisingly close, but in the vast scale of space it was still far enough away to be invisible to the naked eye without perfect conditions. To the universe it was a near miss. To a human standing in a parking lot in Ohio, it was just a Tuesday night. The disappointment was almost instant. It started as a murmur in the crowds. "Is that it?" someone whispered in the silence of New York. "I don't see anything," a child complained to his father. "You promised I would see the fire in the sky." The father adjusted his glasses, looking confused, and, "Wait a minute, maybe it is delayed. But comets are not trains. They are not delayed." Atlas had passed its closest point to Earth exactly when the math said it would. The problem was not the comet. The problem was the expectation. Hollywood movies had taught the human race that a cosmic event must be loud. We expected a soundtrack. We expected the sky to turn purple. We expected a climactic battle between survival and destruction. Instead, we got silence. On the television news channels, the panic was different. It was the panic of producers realizing they had nothing to show. For weeks, the media had sold fear. They had created 3D simulations of the comet striking the Pacific Ocean. They had interviewed experts who spoke about extinction events. They had sold advertisements for survival kits and bunkers. Now the anchor on the main news channel looked at the camera looking slightly foolish. Behind him, a live feed from a high-tech telescope showed a fuzzy grey smudge moving slowly against a black background. "As you can see," the anchor said, his voice lacking energy, "Atlas is passing us right now. It is quite fast, though it looks slow here." The ratings began to drop. People turned off their televisions. In the bars, the volume was lowered and the music started playing again. The tension that had held the world together for a month simply evaporated. It was replaced by a heavy, dull feeling of boredom. It was the feeling of waking up after a party that was cancelled at the last minute. Social media, which had been screaming about the apocalypse for days, suddenly changed its tone. The hashtags changed from "the end is nigh" to #AtlasFlop and #BoringRock. Memes started to circulate. One showed a picture of an empty plastic bag floating in the wind with the caption, "Rare footage of Atlas destroying Earth." The public felt cheated. They felt as if they had bought tickets to the Super Bowl only to arrive at the stadium and find an empty field. The human brain is wired to react to danger. When the danger does not arrive, the brain does not know what to do with all the adrenaline it has produced. People became irritable. Arguments started in traffic. The collective relief of survival was quickly overshadowed by the collective annoyance of an anticlimax. However, in the quiet observatories on the tops of mountains, the mood was different. It was not bored, it was somber. Dr. Aris Thorne sat in front of his monitors. He was not looking at the visual feed. He was looking at the data streams coming from the gravity sensors. The lines on the graph rippled. "Did you feel that?" his assistant asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Aris said. "I didn't feel it. My body is too small, but the Earth felt it." The data showed that as Atlas passed, its massive gravity had tugged gently on the planet. It was a microscopic pull, not enough to cause earthquakes, but enough to slightly shift the magnetic field for a few seconds. It was a reminder of the weight of the visitor. "It is so quiet," the assistant said. "I thought it would be louder." Aris looked out the window at the dark sky. "That is the scary part, isn't it?" Space is silent. A rock that big could wipe out all of history, all of our art, all of our wars, and it wouldn't make a sound until it hit the atmosphere. It just passes by. It does not care that we are here. This was the true horror of Timeline B. It was not the destruction. It was the indifference. The universe did not hate humanity. It simply did not notice humanity. Atlas was a hammer thrown in the dark, and by pure chance it missed the face of the Earth by a few inches. There was no divine intervention. There was no grand narrative. There was just physics, mass velocity and vector. As the night went on, the comet moved away. It faded from the amateur telescopes. The great event was over in less than an hour. By the next morning, the world had returned to a strange aggressive normality. The stock markets opened and people went back to worrying about interest rates. The coffee shops were full. The buses ran on time. The survival kits that people had bought in panic were shoved into the back of closets forgotten. The media stopped talking about space. They went back to talking about politics and celebrity scandals. It was as if the human race was embarrassed. We had shown our fear to the universe, we had screamed and prayed, and the universe had walked past us without even looking down. But for those who truly understood what had happened, the silence remained. Aris walked out of the observatory into the morning light. The sun was rising warm and familiar. The birds were singing. It was a beautiful, perfect day. He looked up at the blue sky where the invisible monster was now rushing away into the deep dark. He shivered. A loud explosion is frightening because it is an attack, but lideniness. Silence is haunting. Silence means you are alone. The comet was gone. We were safe, but the feeling of safety was gone forever. We now knew with absolute certainty that we were living in a shooting gallery. And this time the bullet had just whistled past our ear so fast we didn't even hear it. We went back to work, we went back to school, we pretended it was just a false alarm, but deep down in the quiet moments before sleep, everyone felt the same smallness. The great anticlimax was not a joke, it was a lesson in humility. We realized that the drama was only in our heads. The cosmos does not do drama, it only does silence. As we reach the end of our observation, the great stage of the sky begins to change. The comet, which has been our companion for these past nights, is moving away. The brilliant performance is coming to a close. Now we are left with the silence that comes after a beautiful song has finished. Let us take this moment to think not with our sharp analytical minds, but with our hearts. We float here suspended in the quiet dark, watching Comet Atlas retreat. As it fades, we must ask ourselves a question that humans have asked since the very first time we looked up from the caves. What does it all mean? Is Atlas a message? For weeks we tracked its path, we measured its speed, we analysed the gas and the dust, but beyond the data there feels like there is something more. It feels like a letter sent from the deepest part of the universe delivered to our doorstep. But this letter has no words, it has no language. It is a sealed envelope that we are not meant to open, only to witness. Perhaps the message is simply that we are not alone. We often feel isolated on our blue planet. We feel like we are the only things that matter. But then a traveller like Atlas arrives. It comes from the Oort cloud, a place so far away that the sun is just another bright star in the sky. It reminds us that the neighbourhood of our solar system is vast and busy. There are things moving in the dark, ancient and giant that have nothing to do with our daily lives. Or perhaps Atlas is not a message but a mirror. Think about how the world reacted to this visitor. People stood in fields in the middle of the night. They set up telescopes in backyards. They drove to the tops of mountains just to catch a glimpse of that fuzzy green ball. For a brief moment, we stopped looking down at our phones and our problems. We looked up, we shared a sense of wonder. Maybe that is the true test of humanity's maturity. The universe sends us these wandering stars to see if we are paying attention. It tests us to see if we can still feel awe. It asks us, can you forget your small disagreements for one night? Can you stand together under the canopy of stars and just breathe? When we look at Atlas, we are learning a lesson in humility. In our daily lives, we often feel like we are the centre of everything. Our worries feel giant. Our schedules feel incredibly important. But here in the presence of a comet that takes 80,000 years to complete one orbit, our time feels different. 80,000 years. When Atlas returns, the Earth will look completely different. The cities we know might be gone. The landscapes will have shifted. We will not be here. To some, this thought might be scary, but tonight let it be comforting, let it be a relief. There is a profound peace in realizing how small we are. If we are small, then our mistakes are small. If the universe is infinite, then our worries are just tiny specks of dust floating away in the solar wind. You do not have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. The universe is big enough to carry it for you. You are allowed to simply be. You are allowed to be a small, safe passenger on this planet watching the scenery go by. Now watch as the comet continues its endless voyage. The heat of the sun is fading from its surface. The glorious tail, that long river of light, is starting to dim. The gas is settling down, the dust is quieting. Atlas is packing away its costume. It is preparing for the long cold journey back into the deep dark. It is moving away from the warmth, but it's not afraid. It belongs to the cold. The cold is its home. It is returning to the preservation of the deep freeze where it will drift in silence for eons. Imagine you're travelling with it. Let your mind expand outward, leaving the room you're in. Float up past the clouds, past the moon. Catch up to the fading green light of the comet. You are now drifting in the great void. But this void is not empty. It is full of peace. It is a velvet blanket, soft and heavy, wrapping around everything. There is no sound here. There is no rush. There are no deadlines. There is only the slow rhythmic breathing of the cosmos. You can see the stars around you. They are steady and unblinking. They are the nightlights of the galaxy watching over the journey. As Atlas moves further away, it becomes smaller. It goes from being a bright spectacle to a dim star. Then it becomes a faint smudge. And finally it is just a part of the background. It merges with the shadows. The show is over, the visitor has left the building, and now you remain. You are safe here, you have witnessed the beauty of the skies, and now you can return to your own inner world. Feel the gravity of Earth gently pulling you back down, not dragging you, but holding you. Like a mother holding a child, it pulls you into your bed, it pulls your head into the pillow, it pulls your heavy eyelids down. The energy of the comet has dispersed. The energy of your day has dispersed. Everything is slowing down. The comet slows as it reaches the edge of the system. Your breath slows as you reach the edge of sleep. There is nothing left to see. There is nothing left to analyze. The data is collected, the photos are taken, the memories are stored. Now there is only the darkness. But this is a friendly darkness. It is the same darkness that cradles the stars. It is the same darkness that holds the comet on its long voyage home. Accept the silence. Let your thoughts drift away like the dust in the comet's tail. Let them float off into the nothingness, leaving you clear and calm. You are part of this endless voyage. Every night you travel through the world of dreams, and every morning you return. But for now, the journey is just beginning. Good night to the traveller Atlas. Good night to the stars that guide it. Good night to the quiet universe. And most of all, good night to you. The sky is sleeping. You can sleep too.